Everyone likes to get laid, but no one likes to get laid off. Today, in this episode of Barely Bullish Investing, we're going to talk about how to front run a layoff. So what is front running? In trading and investing and sometimes speculating, front running is where you try to get in on a trade ahead of an anticipated event. For example, if you're aware that a company will buy back a certain number of dollars of shares, you try to buy some of that company's stock in order to sell it when the company's purchasing shares. Or if you anticipate that the Federal Reserve is going to go out and buy a bunch of bonds, a lot of bond traders will go out and buy bonds and then sell them back to the Federal Reserve or another buyer at increased market prices for the bonds. So what we want to do is we want to talk today about how to front run a layoff. I think for most people, myself included, and even you, Alexis, we're both in recession-resistant industries.
Yes.
Very much so. We're both in healthcare. So, when healthcare is one of those 5 or 6 things that people really need: healthcare, energy/utilities, housing, food, water. What else?
I think that's about it.
That's about it. Shelter, which goes to housing. So, we're in one of those industries that's what people need, not what they want. That being said, when there's macroeconomic uncertainty, all kinds of prices can fluctuate, all kinds of things can happen in industries that nobody is currently expecting. So it could be that a lot of the pricing mechanisms currently in healthcare that are allowing companies to pay our salaries are no longer in play. And so we thought about a lot of this stuff for ourselves, and I think a lot of other people should think about it in their industries, and their jobs, and their spouses' jobs and industries as well, to try to front run what would happen if they got laid off, and to prepare now in advance of that. So that if it does happen, God forbid, knock on wood.
Knock on wood.
All right. That if it does happen, that at least there's a plan in place and a very well thought out, detailed plan that can allow hopefully some preparation against the worst of the effects of being laid off, especially having to deal with material declines in standard of living, and especially poor nutrition potentially, or just not having enough capital or cash flow to support yourself. That's not a good place to be. Right. So we're going to talk about this in terms of looking at long-term measures you can do, short-term measures, and then we're going to discuss some realities, what I call corporate realities, or realities of how to view your company, your place in it, and what you can do there to help prevent yourself from being laid off, or help yourself better able to find a job, or be better able to find a job in the event that you get laid off.
Mm-hmm.
Not to pat ourselves too much on the back, but one of the best things you can do is get a career or find a career that's recession-resistant or recession-proof, although I don't think anything's really recession-proof. You can do the research on your own, but in addition to the 5 needs, there are some occupations that tend to be, or some parts of the economy that do well during bad recessions and depressions. For example, alcohol consumption tends to go up during those times. Same thing with tobacco consumption. Cosmetics, hairstylists, those also are parts of the economy that remain pretty robust, even during sharp economic declines. And I don't really care to discuss in detail the reasons for those things, but the fact is those are industries that tend to do well. Even though energy might take a hit in the beginning, there might be some layoffs there. Generally speaking, energy, and by this I mean oil and gas, especially nuclear power, it's something that people need, right? And they need to heat their homes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's currently the best way to do it. So electricity generation, anything that people need, but I'll let you look into it yourself too. There are a lot of industries that people can do and be involved in. Probably also national defense. If we get thrown into a war, that'll probably be a pretty good industry. Considering military careers, I don't know about today, this year, but maybe in the future those will be less undesirable than they are now. But the idea is there are a lot of different recession-resistant industries that people can get into and should at least consider for their primary skill set.
Yeah, and I think we were even discussing how since 2020, it's become much more accessible to obtain a second degree remotely with flexible schedules and the internet access to curriculum and degrees.
I think we were talking about an example of what would happen if you're, let's say, a teacher, right? Or your teacher and your income is largely based on a county tax base. But what happens if that dries up, if a lot of people move out, or there's property devaluation and they can no longer afford to hold on to enough teachers. What would you do in the face of a layoff there? Even if you're a good teacher, and not all teachers are good. In fact, most of them are not, in my opinion. But that's an aside. But even if you're a very good teacher and you didn't deserve anything to get laid off, and your county government, your school system lays you off, what can you do? Well, even just in anticipation of that, like Alexis was saying, there are plenty of ways. I know people have done this personally very well. Who they trained to become nurses and they got most of their degree online. They got their bachelor's of science in nursing, and then you have to do what are called rotations or practicum, which is basically a hands-on apprenticeship. They're also called clerkships, depending on where you're training, what school you're at. The idea is you go and you rotate through different hospitals, different floors, and you pick it up. Right? You've already done the academic work, but then you do your hands-on work in it too. And teachers can do that in the summer, for example. That's just one example we're thinking of where, okay, if you have a career that's less recession resistant, you can retool and get a second career that's recession resistant. Another way we talked about, and this will probably take us to our next point, is being an engineer versus being a tradesman, such as a plumber or an electrician. Obviously, an engineer pretty well known, but engineers are susceptible to downturns in economic cycles. So if, let's say, a large company like General Electric needs to save money, they can slash their research and development, their R&D budget. And if they do that, then a lot of engineers will be out of work. Where I come from a tiny little part of Florida near Cape Canaveral. And in that area, there would be a lot of times when there's economic downturns or even just changes in government spending. And a lot of the engineers that worked out on the Cape, as they call it, the Cape, they get laid off, unfortunately. And I have relatives who are engineers too. Even in other situations, they end up taking contract work and going from town to town, working 1 or 2 year short-term contracts, moving their families along with them. And it was a tough life to live because you were very susceptible to getting the next contract and things like that. Not that I'm trying to play the world's smallest violin for engineers. It is a good job. It's well respected. But they're very sensitive to downturns in the economic cycle. Whereas, and also a lot of tradesmen are too, especially if there's a decrease in construction. Plumbers and electricians are less in demand and therefore get paid less or make less or have fewer opportunities to make money if there's less construction going on. But that being said, there's a certain robustness to tradesmen. Buildings or any companies that continue to remain in business, whether retail, wholesale, commercial, banking, whatever their sectors, industry, they have to have HVAC, right? They have to have plumbing, they have to have working lights.
Electricity,
right? So there's a certain robustness to it. And it is possible that even in a sharp economic downturn in your specific area, let's say you're trained as an engineer and you're also trained as a plumber, and you can do both reasonably well. Then if you get laid off in one job, you still have another industry to turn to. It just makes you more versatile. It makes you more flexible. Obviously, becoming an engineer and a plumber at the same time would be a little harder than kind of retooling as a teacher to a nurse. But these are just two examples we're thinking of. And what I also like about the engineer versus plumber example is a lot of tradesmen in the last 5-10 years, especially, they're making more than people who went to school or comparable. We'll post the engineer versus plumbing rates, but I think engineers make a bit more than plumbers, but plumbers are doing pretty well for themselves. And there are a lot of plumbers out there, or electricians, or carpenters, masons, etc., that are doing far better than people who got less economically productive degrees. The one that people like to beat on is philosophy, right? Or anything that doesn't have a clear economic application directly out of college as an undergraduate. Or even when they do have any applications, it's really just limited to teaching within a university.
But even degrees that have, licensing and real economic output that's associated with them that you can concretely measure, a lot of those degrees, they don't have the same ease with which a electrician or a plumber would have to just go and start their own business. And I think that is hugely, it allows for an uncapped limit, really, to what you can earn. So I think that's something to consider as well.
Oh, absolutely. It's harder to start a medical practice as a physician. The amount of red tape and bureaucratic legwork you have to go through, or the amount of legwork you have to go through to get through all the red tape, is a lot. It's hard to start a business as a pharmacist, too, or as an engineer. Similarly, engineering probably being more a byproduct of economy of scale. All right, how are you going to compete or bid against contracts of multi-billion-dollar capitalized, well-established companies if you just started?
Right.
Yeah.
The trade industry doesn't have that. They're not up against like these. I mean, there are some. I think of like Roto-Rooter comes to mind as a plumbing agency, but it's not the same as like engineers, for example, coming up against GE or something.
Right, right.
But not that's not to denigrate plumbers or electricians. I think what they do is great. My family is in that industry as well. So,
right, right.
But
it's
just a matter of fact that there's just less. It's not that it's easier to run a business at all. It's still a very difficult and an admirable thing, but there's less.
I think the word you're looking
red
for.
tape.
I was going to say it's a barrier to entry.
Right.
So red tape refers just to regulation that keeps you from opening, but there's also competitive forces that are not regulatory.
Both,
right?
but I think both are in play.
Yeah. So being in an industry, even if it's still kind of recession sensitive, but at least you have more flexibility. That could be really good too.
Yeah.
Kind of starting your own business or being, if you can, wherever possible, being in an industry where you could make profits.
Right, or just be like a solo show, where you don't need an employer. Rather, you just find work for yourself. That's something that can be done with, things that are more like trade type jobs rather than professional degrees.
One job I really like for any kind of recession or depression that maybe it's not a lot of people's radar, I think a mechanic. Being a mechanic, a car mechanic, is a great job. Mm-hmm. And the reason I think that is because there are a lot of cars out there. And mechanics don't make money in contrast to like electricians. Mechanics don't make money if there are more cars being produced. A mechanic is a totally different job than an auto factory worker, right? Mm-hmm. Even though there's some common skill sets, they're different jobs. And so if there are a lot of cars on the road and people cannot afford to buy new cars, that hurts the car manufacturers, right, and the factory laborers. But it helps the mechanic because the mechanic's getting a lot more business. And if we do go into a very steep recession or depression, I think it's a great skill set to have.
Yeah.
If you can work on cars and help people basically duct tape their engine together at a low cost and keep it running, I think you're gonna be great business.
Yeah, and it's another thing where you don't need to work for someone else. You could just have a garage in your home and say, hey, neighbors, friends, family, if you guys need my help fixing up your car, you can pay me cash. I'll take care of it cheaper than the automobile mechanic down the street can. And you can still have your day job and just be doing this on the side on the weekends as there's business or as there's need.
Yep. That's a skill set I wish I had.
You're not a car guy.
Not as much as I'd like to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe there's a master class for that.
No, master class. It's one of those things. It really helps if you have the right tools for the trade. Because I'm always trying to take a crescent wrench to do everything, and what you need is a hydraulic lift and a set of tools and everything else, which I don't have. Maybe air compression. Well, anyway, that's neither here nor there. So having a recession-resistant career is a good idea. But in addition, a long-term measure you can always do is store lots of cash or liquid wealth or gold. I previously said it's a very good idea to keep a good amount of your storable wealth that you intend to use in case you get laid off outside of the banking system. I continue to believe that very strongly for reasons I've stated previously. But having a certain amount of cash and a certain amount of gold in safe places that are private to you, and ideally having a large amount of that. If you can store up a year, 2 years, better get 3, 4, 5 years of that, and you get laid off, that's almost inconsequential. I mean, it's not entirely because you have nothing to do for a while. It can look bad for your resume or CV. Okay, but in terms of immediate effects, if you've saved up a large liquid or a large buffer of liquid assets that hold their value over time, you're fine. Mm-hmm. You're going to be okay. I know this is not easily achievable for everybody, and certainly isn't starting today as day one. But if over the long term you can do that, that's a very smart idea. And that goes along with the next point, which is to live below your means, right? Life is a lot less stressful if your means are up here and you're living here. Doesn't matter if you're making 5 figures, 6 figures, or 7 figures. That always remains the case. And the closer you live to your means, the longer you'll have to work, the harder life can be, the fewer investment opportunities you have. It's just a very bad idea.
Yeah, it introduces a lot of stress.
It does.
If you can avoid it, I understand. I think some 5-figure salaries may leave people.
Sure, yeah, and especially when you're starting out too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like it just adds unnecessary stress if you have the ability to live below your means.
Absolutely, absolutely. Another long-term measure you can do to front-run being laid off is maintain a good network. What do I mean by that? If you're in a certain field, you're a businessman, keeping up with the people in the community, being socially active. If you're in the corporate world, getting to know kind of some of the people in the C-suites, and getting along with your bosses' friends, your coworkers. I know, depending on your job, if you really don't like your job, maybe this is very distasteful, but as long as you're in a decently non-toxic work environment, I think that's a great idea. Just network within your company, network with other people outside of your company, go to trade shows where you can meet people, get contacts, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you get laid off, if you've made a contact of people you met at a conference or a trade show 5 years ago, well, maybe you can give them a call and they'll at least met you and kind of maybe to have some lunch with you or something. And they'll be more likely to hire you than just some random person who's sending in an application. So networking always helps. Find a niche is something you can do. A lot of jobs have this as an option. We mentioned being a mechanic. Well, there are niche mechanics who can take apart certain types of cars, who are better with certain European cars or domestic cars or whatever. There are niches in nursing. There are nurses who can do certain types of work. They can help with, let's say, cardiac catheterization, for example. That's just one. Or there are engineers who can learn a certain programming language that only works with a certain type of basically biotechnological instrument that only they know, or only they and maybe 500 other engineers in the country know. If you have a niche like that, as long as your company doesn't downgrade its R&D or go out of business, that makes you very valuable. And we'll talk about this more later, but being valuable to your company is very good. Or being able to offer a skill set into the market that employers will really want to pay you for, that few other people can offer, is a very good place to be.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I would add, be mobile and adaptable, right? Be willing to move if you can. A lot of people, this kind of contradicts having a network because it's hard to move around a lot and also maintain a network. But if you can be, that's great. And especially be psychologically adaptable. I think if you're already of the mindset that you can get laid off, for example, I'm about to start a new job. I'm going to move across the country, but I'm going into this job assuming that I'm going to be laid off just to start. And then all my planning is coming from there. Right.
The assumption is based off of the economy, not because you're planning on being a bad employee, right?
Right. No, certainly. Well, that'd be getting fired. No, and it's a very solid company. It's the third largest in the industry. It's extremely well capitalized. I haven't yet looked over. I should have already done this. I haven't looked over their balance sheet, but I have every reason to believe it's fine. Good, solid company.
And you still have this low expectation.
Right. Well, I'm still. Well, because also we're going to an area where the economy there might not be too good if we go into a depression, and therefore the base for the business I'm going to join might go down too. Their revenues, their volume might go down, but we'll see. But at the end of the day, I'm starting my planning as if I'm going to be laid off, and again, we're in recession-resistant industries, and that's where my planning starts.
And that's
everything
the mentality
comes
that you think
right.
is good to have.
And so if I have that mentality, and a year and a half from now, or 2 years, or 3 years, they say, "Hey, sorry, we have to send you home, Michael." I'll say, "Oh, that's fine. I already I got everything saved up. I'm ready to go." I've been looking forward to this thing for a long time.
I've been training for this.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I think maybe piggybacking off of that, I did think this is a long term, right, that we're talking about.
Yeah, long-term measures.
I think
one layoff.
Yeah, one long-term measure that comes to mind, kind of also relevant, is signing a contract if you can with an employer, and maybe even if that means sacrificing a little bit of the potential income that you could have for the security of a longer lasting position. So maybe you take a lower income, but you're guaranteed a job for an extra 2 years on a contract.
Yeah.
That makes sense in a period of time where you're concerned about the job security.
I think it's a very good point, and it's really helpful if the company that you're working for doesn't go out of business. No. I mean, I'm not saying it's tongue in cheek. No, I'm being serious. Okay. Well, okay, so if as long as the company's still in business, they have to honor all their contracts.
Yeah.
Right? And you could get, if things get bad enough, a lot of companies are going out of business, and there's no way you can prevent it. But in as much as you can prevent, the company being able to lay you off by having a contract, that's a very good thing to do. I will point out that there is a clause, it's force majeure, and companies can say, or if they just go into bankruptcy, they can say, yeah, we can't pay any of our employees, and we're out of business now, so we can't honor our contracts. That's part of the bankruptcy process. So having a multi-year contract, I think, is advantageous if you can get it, but it's not absolute. It's not a quote guarantee, and it's certainly not an absolute guarantee. It's it's something that can help you in certain circumstances, and it's good to have if you can get it. And would it be worth to accept maybe 2 or 3 or 5% less pay to get a multi-year contract? Well, it depends on your industry and your position and several other factors, but it could be. And thinking about those things, or thinking about things in those terms, is probably not a bad idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on now to short-term measures, because a lot of the long-term measures we've discussed so far are things that maybe you've already done or you haven't. And yeah, sure, you can start to put things in place, even watching this today, going forward and say, okay, I'm going to do this, this, and that among these long-term measures. And you can probably think of several others of your own that would probably be advantageous. But in addition to long-term measures, it's worth thinking about short-term measures, because I don't think there's a lot of time left for a lot of people. I'm not saying everyone's being laid off tomorrow. I'm not saying everyone's being laid off. I'm not saying we're going into an apocalypse. I'm not saying that life is over for everybody. I am saying that layoffs are occurring right now, today. They're starting in the tech sector. They're in the industrial and freight sector. They're in large companies that are well capitalized and have a lot of cash on hand. So if these companies are laying off people and they don't yet have to, how bad could it be for companies that don't have that kind of cash on hand? What are they going to be experiencing? Raise a lot of questions. Layoffs are currently happening in large numbers, and I think the trend is going to continue.
I have a question,
Yeah.
because I don't know the answer, but would large companies lay off a lot of employees usually prior to small companies having issues, or less well-capitalized companies?
I think it depends a lot on the sector and also a lot of other specifics. There are a couple things we're thinking of. The first is employment scarring, which is that Neil McCoy talks a lot about this. He's exactly right, which is where you have companies or you have industries that start to lay off, and then those industries start to decline in utility, or they're not doing as much, they're not as active. And then the people who had trained for those industries, they can't immediately retrain, even if they want to, and a lot of them don't, either because they can basically be on the dole indefinitely, or they can retire already, or for other reasons, or they're technically not able to very easily. So there's employment scarring, so you can permanently lose employees that drop out of the workforce. I think we saw a lot of that with the endemic-related lockdowns. A more recent thing that we saw was there was a reluctance, or I think there has been over the last year or two, a reluctance of a lot of employers, large and small, to again lay off or employees, and they've been willing to take losses recently. I can't remember who came up with this idea. I heard it recently, and I think they're right. Might have been Lance Roberts again. It also could have been Peter Schiff. One of the two were talking about it. That basically employers in the last year or two have been reluctant to lay off employees because this last 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, it's been very hard for most employers in most sectors to find willing employees for a lot of reasons.
And so therefore they don't want to go through the process.
Right. Because managers are people too, and if you have to keep rehiring, that eats up a lot of your day, and you're doing a lot of long nights with that. Who wants to do that if they can quit? So unlike other recessions, or in recent modern history and even depression, I think it's possible at least that employers in aggregate will be willing to take more capital losses or losses to their profits, or more L in the P&L statements than they would in past times, whereas maybe in the 90s or the 60s, employers were more readily willing to lay off their workforces. Yeah. But it is a sign if employers, regardless of the decade or side of the business cycle, if employers are laying off large numbers of people, it's generally a very bad sign, because even though labor costs are usually the highest line item in the budget for costs for most employers, most industries, it's still one of the last things you want to do, because you have entropic changes that when you disorganize a labor force that has already learned how to work together, that already gets along, that already has clear hierarchical structures, that already has clear interactions, and everyone knows the rules and how the game is played. If you get rid of 1% or 5%, you're not going to notice significant impairment in function. You have to get rid of half, and then potentially you have to hire on 20% back. You become very disorganized, and that eats away at productivity. It eats away at profits. So
there's a resistance to laying off too many people unless it's absolutely necessary.
Right.
Even if it is expensive. And then I guess in addition to that, just piggybacking off of my own question, I'm sure, as you have, these layoffs are not insignificant. There's large numbers of people being laid off in these companies. Well, if they are losing their income stream, they're going to be spending less. And then there's less consumer spending, which then affects other businesses. So I'm sure, just speaking economically, just practically, it makes sense that, the more you have large layoffs, the more the economy suffers and possibly can cause a cascade of further unemployment.
Right. And that's part of why you see when the economic cycle goes south, when things deteriorate, you usually see a lot of things happening simultaneously. You see asset devaluations and a credit collapse, and companies having to close because they were over leveraged, and layoffs, and then decreases consumer discretionary and other consumer spending, and further devaluation of prices, and all these factors begin to start feeding off themselves.
Right. Yeah. Well, at any rate, you were saying, I think you were talking about layoffs.
So we wanted to go back to just the short-term measures. What can you do today, right now, if you're concerned about being laid off? And I think most people watching this should be. Obviously, I don't know you personally or your situation or your company or your industry, but I do know that a lot of companies are going to be facing layoffs, and the risk is very real for a lot of people. And thinking about it now is wise. All right, so what can we do today? So very first thing you can do is you can stop all discretionary spending immediately. And if you haven't already, save up at least a 2 months buffer of cash. That is enough cash in the bank or in hand, or even converting some of it to gold, maybe. But to be able to take care of all your expenses for 2 months. That's a bare minimum, right? Bare minimum. So be able to pay the rent or mortgage, be able to pay your grocery costs, utility costs, everything else. If you haven't, and that simultaneously goes without saying, if you have any credit card debt, pay that off immediately. Probably before you even accumulated 2 months of cash. Get rid of all credit card balances and get 2 months cash buffer. If you don't do that right now, I think you're going to have a lot of regrets.
Yeah.
And everyone, consumer discretionary budgets are usually between 6 and 20% of most household budgets. Everyone can find something to cut. And I've lived lean for most of my life. I am unsympathetic to anybody who doesn't want to cut expenses. I've lived in a truck for months on end. I've lived in all kinds of crazy situations. I've lived off of ramen and carrots and broccoli for long periods of time, lentils. I've done it all. I've seen it all. I know what steps are necessary to be taken. I know how to dramatically reduce costs. There are ways to do it, plenty of ways to do it. If you guys in the future want us to go through a detailed list of ways to do it, I'd be more than happy to. But definitely get rid of the discretionary spending, pay off any credit card debt, and hold on to 2 months of cash. And if it's necessary for you to make a budget for this purpose, some people use budgets, some people don't. If you can be fiscally disciplined without a budget, fine, good for you. If you have problems with being fiscally disciplined, create a budget, don't exceed certain costs. Some people will even go to the measures of getting debit cards every month and just front-loading the balance and only spending an amount. Whatever you have to do to pay off any consumer debt and credit card debt, do it. The problem is right now, consumer credit card debt keeps going up. The revolving facility on consumer credit card debt is rising over time, meaning people, unfortunately, are contracting more debt. Don't be one of those people. Bad idea. And hold a cash buffer. Okay, the next thing you can do in the short term is you can start to become familiar with some of the processes of what happens when you become laid off, especially if you've never been laid off or fired before or quit a job. So you can become familiar with the unemployment claims process. Know in your area, it varies from locality to locality, from state to state. Know what to expect. Know how to fill out the paperwork. Know when to expect payments to start arriving. Know what their amounts are likely. That way, when you're making a contingency plan, you know, okay, well, I can expect maybe about 2 months, the state that I'm living in, they'll pay me X dollars a month starting at that time. And I can expect that to last, I think it's about 99 months if you've been paying unemployment insurance at least. Check your situation. Maybe you haven't been paying unemployment insurance in your area. Maybe you have. Make sure you look into that. Make sure you know what to expect. Because the last thing you want to do is be counting on getting unemployment if you need to, or any kind of charitable contribution to your income, and then that's not available.
Right.
Right. And the floor is pulled out from under you. And now not only are you suddenly without a job and maybe you don't even have savings, But now this crutch that you're expecting to lean on either gets delayed substantially or it's not available. And I'll add one other point. If there's a massive macroeconomic change, there's a lot of people becoming unemployed. That the state or locality, the unemployment office, they can only process so many applications within such a certain period of time. So if you and everyone else in your town or cities is suddenly unemployed, even I say everyone else, but I mean, let's say unemployment goes from the U6 number of 6% to 12%, there are going to be pretty long lines there, right? And so if you know the process, if you have an edge in the process or whatever, that's good. But if you can also anticipate delays and be able to hold through with your savings through those delays, likewise, will be put at an advantage.
Yeah.
And your life will be easier. Same thing for considering health insurance. If you have to self-pay for that, know where to get it, how to get it, what kind of policy you might want to get, what kind of policy you and your loved ones might need. And also, if you end up qualifying or you're able to qualify for Medicaid, know your state's policies on that, know some of the federal policies, know what you'll have to pay out of pocket, et cetera, et cetera. Have an idea of these things, even if you don't go into all the minutiae and technical details. Another thing you consider is if you do have to skip payments on a student loan or a mortgage or other long-term debt you're holding, know what the policies for that are. Read through the forbearance policies for your student loans ahead of time. They're generally uniform, but there are some exceptions for certain different subtypes of loans. Of course, as I say that, the federally nationalized student loans still don't own interest rates.
I don't think so.
They don't have to pay the interest rates. So
it's coming back soon, though.
I know because I have them, and I haven't paid anything on my loans in like 2 years. It's ridiculous. And then if you have a mortgage too, no, okay. Obviously, if you miss a student loan or mortgage payment, that's not good. It hurts your credit. But no, too, how long can you stay in your house?
Right.
What is the process if you were able to make, let's say, 3 payments out of 6? Can you get away with doing that? Would you do them all 3 at once, or maybe you pay every other month, or something along those lines?
Yeah.
Knowing what can do, knowing what you can do to keep keeping your house and keep your mortgage from being shut down and you're having to get kicked out of your house, always a good idea.
Of course.
Yeah. And then we sort of mentioned this with the long-term things, but even in the short term, there are things you could do starting today. Again, we brought up the example of a teacher training online to be a nurse. There are a lot of things you can do online. There are a lot of things, a lot of other areas you can get into. You can at least start the ball rolling on the process of getting things online. You can start applying to a school if you want, or to an academy, or to a trade school, to university, college, whatever, and look for economically viable degrees and start those. If you get laid off, let's say you knew for a fact you'd get laid off in a year, and you were 1 year into, let's say, a 4-year program, well, hey, okay, you already knocked out a year of it, right? And maybe you can take out loans for it, or you can, if you're paying for your own education, that's tax deductible. So you can also take a tax write-off on that. And then it's also assumed you can afford it. But, start thinking about this. Like, okay, if you are concerned about being laid off and you want to start to kind of retool into another career, what can you get into? Or if you want to learn how to be a mechanic, if you have spare weekends and evenings, or especially weekends, and you know a mechanic shop in the area, go work there for a while.
Yeah.
Go apply, get a job. Tell them, okay, I'm this over here. I'm an accountant, or I'm a teacher, or whatever I am, and I want to learn how to be a mechanic. Okay, well, go do that.
Yeah.
Right? Now's the time.
Yeah. I just feel like there's a lot of even outside of the online classes, there's a lot of weekend programs and evening, night classes for various things. I'm sure trade is even, I don't know how that works, but I'm sure there's programs for that as well.
Sure.
But yeah.
Or just on the job. A lot of really good jobs out there. You don't need to have a ton of experience. They'll start taking you on. They'll start showing you the ropes. Yeah, kind of as an apprentice or kind of low level. You're going to run around, change tires a bunch if you're working at a mechanic shop. Mm-hmm. But then there's certain certifications you can get. Same thing with programming. Like maybe you start, or IT, you start off with the very basic stuff like just fielding calls. But then as you get more certifications and you learn better how to manage networks, then you're given more responsibility. It's the same idea.
Yeah.
IT is another good one. That's a weird hybrid between kind of a college job and a trade school. It has kind of flavors of both. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of opportunity in that sector too, because people are always going to want to connect their computers and have difficulty doing it, or connect, surround sound systems or projectors. And businesses have huge IT needs, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they're always going to have to keep their infrastructure, servers, and communications between different computers, et cetera, et cetera.
And the nice thing about IT and maybe other positions as well that's worth considering is the ability to work remotely. I mean, if you can do that, and even if if you need to get a job because you can't find one in your area, but you can find one across the country that you can do completely remotely, and you don't want to move. I mean, that's a huge advantage. So there's definitely a benefit to having remote work.
It's interesting that you brought that up. I think there's a counter trend. There's a huge trend toward remote work in 2020. I think there's a massive counter trend against it because employers are starting to realize in most industries and most companies, they're not getting as much productivity out of remote workers.
I could see that.
Right, just like remote schooling doesn't work at the same rate. Students just don't pay attention, and pupils. But that being said, yeah, if you can find a niche, there are a few niches that are really good for that. IT is probably one of them.
Yeah.
Or even just jobs where you can just go to work maybe 2 or 3 days a week rather than all 5. That could be nice too.
Yeah.
I would say if you have a remote work from home job right now, I wouldn't count on continuing to have it. If you're able to continue it and it's that position stays as it is, God bless you. That's great. Enjoy it. Like I think it's great. I think if people can be equally productive at home and companies can realize that in certain applications, I think it's fantastic. I have nothing personal against it. I just think that counting on that, the typical example might be somebody who works for a big tech firm and they didn't want to live in California because the cost of living is very high. A lot of Californians went to places like Tennessee or Idaho or Texas. And with the idea that they could work remotely, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not a bad idea on the face of it, but I think that could be a mistake if they eventually have to be recalled to, work again in person.
Yeah.
Right. And if you've plunked down money in a house in one of those places and kind of started to put down roots there, then I think they can be sort of difficult. So yeah. I think counting on remote work, unless you really know your industry, you really know your company, you have very good reason to believe that it will continue. Could be a mistake.
Yeah, probably anything that was remotely available before COVID, I would think, would be pretty reliably going to maintain that. But maybe if it's been a post-COVID transition to remote work, that could reverse over time. Yeah. I could see that being.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the remote work. Yeah.
What else do you have?
Well, I think people right now, if they haven't already, they should hunker down where they're at. Maybe in some limited circumstances, locations, and industries, there might be an ability to switch. Okay, and I'm violating this principle myself because I'm doing the opposite. I'm making a switch, but I have complicated and very good career reasons for doing it that allow me to broaden my skill set and be able to find more work in the future. So that's do as I say, not as I do. No, I think it's a very good idea to hunker down if you can. A lot of people, I think, have been making lateral transitions from company to company. And the logic behind this makes sense. I'm not insulting it. I think it's a good idea for what it is. But the caution there is if you do that too much, you hop around too much. In fact, we were talking to a friend who's having a hard time finding a job because she did just that. Just kind of made too many career transitions. Yeah. So generally speaking, employers don't like that. But more importantly, if things go from being on the side of labor, as they are now, to being on the side of corporations or business management, then they're going to tend to pick people who've been more stable in their jobs than people who are less stable. I think we can all realize that.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, when I say hunker down, I mean, evaluate your position within whatever company you're in. Look at the skill sets that they need. Try to adapt yourself to best meet whatever it is that you can understand that they need. And different jobs and careers have different abilities to do this. Obviously, if you're working on an HVAC somewhere or you're working in custodial services somewhere, there's not too much else you can do. I mean, just keep doing your job and do it well. But maybe if you're in accounting or you see, okay, well, if we do A, B, and C, we can probably save this much money, whatever, and you go to your boss with that, well, that's value.
Right. Make yourself more valuable, because I do think there's going to be a shift. If unemployment starts to rise, it will no longer be the power, I think, will shift. Right now, I think a lot of the laborers or the employees have a lot more overall power. When that shifts back to the employer, I think, being a good employee and having added a lot of value to the company will help, I'm sure, prevent you from being one of the first on the chopping block.
Yep.
And the first hired, last.
Well, we're going to get to that later.
Oh,
last hired, first fired.
Yeah, sort of.
We'll talk more on that later. Yeah. But basically, hunker down where you're at if you can. Or, if you decide that you have real concerns, we'll get to this more later, but if you have real concerns about your company, now's probably the time to try to switch if you're going to. I think it's going to be much harder in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Although if you get laid off, then I guess it'll be a lot easier in the future. But probably you don't want to have to do it that way. It's much better to try to undertake a transition willingly. So be careful not to hop around too much, and find a good place. Find a place that works for you if you can, and try to stay there and make them very happy. Yep. Although I think from a lot of industries, I think it probably is too late to switch. I think it's going to be hard to do. I wanted to touch too on another short-term thing people can do, and this is beyond just decreasing discretionary spending. It's probably time for a lot of people, especially if they have a lot of debt, to consider radical spending downgrades. Now, we talked about this in the de-risking video, so I'm not going to beat it to death, but I think it's very important to take this into consideration. If you get laid off, even before you get laid off, think about what you can cut. Think about cash flow needs that you can get rid of. Create, where you can, mutual assistance agreements between you and family members, you and friends, you and roommates. Have things set up in advance. If one of us loses our job, we'll do this. We'll agree to live together, or we'll agree to pool our grocery expenditures. Especially if you have roommates, things like that. Another thing you can do. And the more indebted you are, probably the more radically you'll have to do this.
Yeah.
If you're just carrying like a $5,000 credit balance and you have, let's say, $10,000 of cash in the bank, okay, you're okay. Pay off that balance, hold on that $5,000, you're set. If you have a $15,000 credit balance and you have $500 in the bank, you've got to make a lot of changes, and you've got to make them probably now. You should anyway, even if the business cycle was in a good place, which it isn't. But even now it's more important than ever, because a lot of people are going to be taken out to the woodshed and beat to death by their own debt. It's gonna be rough. It's gonna be rough.
Yeah.
And I hate to see it happening. It's unfortunate that it's gonna happen. I just hope people who are watching this now get ahead of your debt, have a cash balance, and whatever you need to do today to do that, you should do.
And refer to the de-risking video for more information about how to radically cut your budget, because I think we addressed a lot of that.
Right.
Yeah, radical budgeting.
So if as needed, when needed, if needed. And then the last short-term thing you can do, not everyone can do this, it's pretty tough, but you can get some sort of side hustle. The classical example, we mentioned this in the de-risking video, as well as, have boarders at your house, charge people rent to live in a room in your house. Okay, but other things you can do, especially if you have a little capital laying around, is maybe you can start a franchise. Maybe you can, like McDonald's maybe, or a gas station. If you can own one of those or be a partner in one of those, that can be a good idea. Something that
a franchise that's recession resistant.
Right. Start
Don't open
a bakery. Right. Don't open a bakery or a fancy restaurant. Now's probably not the time for it. Now, if you're in those industries and you know what you're doing, that's an entirely different thing.
Right.
But if you're looking to expand into a new business, if you can find something that's recession resistant and generates cash, it might be something to think about. Especially if you have the ability to, or if let's say you're unemployed and your spouse is working, but you want to kind of chip in. Well, now might be the time, to make that kind of change. Or again, find just find a side hustle if you can. And in such a side hustle, try to avoid things that are not really cash flow generating. Like, as much fun as we're having here, this probably isn't anytime soon going to be cash flow generating. We're not doing this as a side hustle. We're doing it because we really love it. But making things on Etsy, for example, that's nice, but that's consumer discretionary spending. That's the first thing people are going to cut out of their budgets if they're having a hard time paying the bills or feeding their families. So, but then again, chopping firewood and selling that off, especially with high energy costs, especially in Europe right now, that might be a good side hustle to do, right? So, and a lot of people do have a little bit of land and they have some trees on it, so that could be something to do. Your own circumstances much better than Alexis or I do, but consider getting on a side hustle if you can find it. And this is different from, retooling and having a second career. I just mean taking skills or resources you already have and just working extra hard, maybe working extra 8 hours on Saturday and Sunday, just to have a little more income coming in can be a good idea, where possible.
Yeah.
Okay. So corporate realities. I'll start off this section by pointing out that your job is only as strong as your company, and maybe even less strong than that. And what do I mean by that? If you were working for a company that has a lot of debt right now, they're as vulnerable as a person who's got a very large credit card balance because interest rates are going up. I believe that's going to continue, but even if they remain where they are, a lot of companies cannot make enough to even cover their debt interest payments. They're called zombie companies, and they're around 20% of the S&P. If you're working, It is. It's crazy. The S&P 500. So if you're working for one of those companies, you're in trouble. If those companies go under and they go into bankruptcy, you no longer have a job. So I think one of the first things people should do is take a look at their companies, a good hard look. The second thing, when I say it could be even less strong, is to look at your place in the company as what you do for the company. For example, whether you're an accountant or you're working in HVAC or you're working in C-suite or you're working in whatever, sales. Know your position and how weak or strong that is. And then know your own individual position. Among all the salesmen, are you the best salesman? Are you the middle of the range? Among all the accountants, are you the easiest to work with? Do you complete your projects on time? I'm throwing out examples here, but you get the idea. Look at it from the strength of your company, the strength of the work you do for the company, irrespective of your performance, and then your performance for the company. Kind of look at it that way. And the best way to evaluate a company, I think, especially if it's a publicly traded company, publicly traded companies put out what are called 10Q statements. So 10-Q. Every quarter they have to report certain financial metrics of the company to the public. So you can look through the 10Qs. If you guys want, we can do a video on how to interpret balance sheets. It's pretty easy to do, but and income statements and cash flow statements. But get an idea. How much money is your company taking in, right? How much is it paying on interest? Those are the two biggest things I'm concerned about right now. And also, how much debt do they have? So if your company has $100 million of debt and they're paying 5% interest on that, and that's about to go, let's say, to a 10% interest, their debt service payments are going from $5 to $10 million a year, let's say. And let's say that company only has $1 million in profit today. Well, your company's in trouble. They're going to have to start burning through cash. And when companies start burning through cash, that's when they start doing layoffs. That's when they start considering bankruptcy, et cetera, et cetera. You don't want to be in that position. Know your company's financial metrics if you can. Now, that being said, there are small businesses and also larger private companies or medium-sized companies that don't give this information out publicly. This might be a time, especially if you're up for a performance interview or there's some sort of discussion about layoffs, or even just during a time where you can have a head-to-head with your boss. It might be a time to very, very politely ask, okay, I just want to know, where is this kind of, I'd like to know a little bit about this kind of company's health. Yes, I appreciate we've discussed me and we discussed our relationship, our working relationship, but I just want to, as an employee of this company, I want to know kind of where we sit. Could I get some of our numbers, right? Could I get our, let's say our last quarter's balance sheet, an income statement? Yeah. I think that's a reasonable ask. Maybe you won't get it, but you can at least ask for it. Mm-hmm. There's also subscriptions you can get to. I think the service is called EDGAR, EDGAR. I forget what it stands for, but it's an acronym that allows you. It's a database of a lot of private companies that still have to have report certain financial data, but it's not publicly available. You have to get a subscription for it. Okay. Well, if you have to pay $100, I don't know what the fees are, but $100 or $200 a year to keep up with that, to know whether your company's going bankrupt or not, that's probably worthwhile.
Especially given the macroeconomic climate.
Right. Yeah. So get an idea of your company's health. Secondly, figure out where you are in the company. Let's say you work for a company like Walmart, which I believe doesn't have a lot of debt, reasonably well capitalized. They also have groceries and other things that people kind of tend to need. So they're probably more recession resistant than other industries or other companies. Okay, you can look up their debt, but let's say you have to examine, or you should examine, your role in Walmart. Okay, Walmart's going to need people to move their stuff around. Walmart's going to need people to keep the stores running. They're going to need people to manage the stores. They're going to need security. They're going to need all those things. IT infrastructure, definitely, and they're going to need accounting and what they call sales, general, and administrative. But maybe a company like Walmart, maybe they would sacrifice a little bit of their SG&A. Maybe they lay off some accountants, right? Mm-hmm. Because they have to cut costs, right? They can do that. Or maybe they'll lay off some of their retail workforce, and just because there's less foot traffic, maybe they'll get rid of some of the cashiers, right? Or maybe they'll close down their auto repair business, or even make it larger. Who knows? But having an idea in your company, talking to your management, if you're not in management already, talking to your management and getting an idea of where they see the company going as new events unfold and macroeconomic conditions change. If you can keep your finger on the pulse of that, I think that's very helpful. And anticipating a layoff, word goes around that Walmart might lay off some of its accounting staff. Well, then you can start looking for a job, right? And whereas people who don't have their ear to the ground on that and aren't paying attention, they're going to kind of be, they're going to be behind behind the eight ball. I'm sorry to mix metaphors. They're going to be a little bit behind you because you've gone ahead and you've front run the layoff by anticipating it and starting to apply elsewhere.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe by the time they even realize they're getting laid off, you've already gone on 2 or 3 different interviews and you're about to ink a job with the next company. Right.
Yeah.
So that's a good place to be. Be adaptable. Pay attention to what's going on in your company. That is company-specific information that you have that no financial advisor will have, that no friend will have, no family member will have. You can investigate that through your own, on your own, and figure it out. And then the last of those 3 things you can do, so know your company, know your position in the company, and then know your specific individual performance in the company. Now's the time, probably more than any other time in our lifetimes, except maybe when people are very first starting out in their careers. Maybe that's comparable, but now is probably the best time to be the very best worker. This is not me drinking the Kool-Aid saying, oh, everyone should be a perfect worker, be happy where you're at, et cetera, even if your company isn't so great. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying the value to you as an individual of you working well in your company is higher now than it ever would be. What do I mean by that? The last 2 years, labor had the upper hand. People were doing a lot of what they called quiet quitting. Have you heard of this?
We discussed it briefly, but I had not heard of it prior.
Okay. Well, basically, it's this trend where people are intentionally being less productive, kind of phoning it in, kind of not really trying so hard on their jobs because they're tired of working or they feel they should be paid more. And so instead of asking for a raise, they start being less productive.
Mm-hmm.
And employees had gotten away with it, have gotten away with it, might still get away with it a little bit longer, as long as they have, as you described previously, the upper hand in negotiation against employers and management. That might not remain the case, though. And if there's around the layoffs that are happening, 2 rules probably come to mind that govern, 2 heuristics probably govern what a lot of employers are going to do. First of all, they'll get rid of people who are unproductive or who are productive but maybe cause problems, right? So the more problematic you are in the workforce and the less productive you are, I think the higher you have a layoff risk. And of course, the other heuristic is less hired versus fired. So if you've been around a company for 5 or 10 years, you're less likely to get laid off than somebody who's only been there for 2,
Mm-hmm.
all else being equal,
Mm-hmm.
right? So keep in mind your position there. Keep that in mind, and definitely don't conflate size with stability for your company. So let's say you work for a large company. Just because they're large doesn't mean they're not indebted. I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but anyway. What else? Another thing to think about is if you're getting laid off, let's say Walmart's laying off a lot of accountants, right? Well, there could be another company. It could be that throughout the entire business sector, throughout different companies or different industries, that let's say Walmart's laying off their accountants, banks are laying off their accountants, restaurant chains are laying off their accountants. It could be that you're stuck in a situation where mass layoffs are happening across different sectors that tend to affect your job the most. And I'm not trying to pick on accountants. I'm just saying, if your industry or people within your part of the industry are getting laid off or having to deal with that, likely other companies are doing something similar, right? For many of the same reasons. So keep in mind that too. It's one thing to try to transfer to a different job or try to find a job elsewhere when you've been laid off from one company, but keep in mind it might not happen. You might be in an industry where it's hard to find a job, even if you're very good, even if you've done a great job for your company, even if you can get a very strong letter of recommendation. If your entire industry or component of the industry, such as accounting, is getting laid off, or engineering, or whatever else, retail, many other companies might be having the same problem, and many other former employees could be facing the same problem and issues. So some good general advice for trying to keep the job you have, because as I said, it's going to be very valuable for you now and in the future, is, and again, I say this knowing the context that I believe with the help of central banks, management classes or management firms, companies, large corporations especially, have decreased the real wages of labor over time, especially over the last 50 years. Charles Hughes Smith writes a lot about this, and I think he makes a lot of great points. That the real compensation of most people, of most employees since 1971 has gone down, and corporate profits have gone up. I don't believe that's right, because in a free market scenario that wouldn't happen, and it's only occurring because of the central bank policies, basically screwing a lot of people out of their hard-earned money, basically, or currency.
And
So,
then likewise artificially helping the stock market.
Right.
Stock prices elevate.
A lot of these
Yeah.
manipulations have been helping the very wealthy and also owners of capital rather than workers.
Mhm.
So I do believe in a full free market with the support of the rule of law, and this is not that. So I say this, I say a lot of these suggestions and tips with that context fully in mind. But that being said, even if you're in a company that's been part of the group that's been screwing over labor, it still stands the fact that their value to you is higher now than it is in other times. And it's more important now than ever to specifically be less problematic, be nice, get along with your coworkers, even if they're jerks, and do a good job, and find ways you can do a better job for your company. Realizing you still might get laid off, but even if you do a good job, and I'm not saying you spend an extra 10 or 20 hours every week, but go the extra mile where you can a little bit, chip in where you can. Be pleasant in your work environment. Do a good job. Be an asset to your employer as much as possible rather than a liability. And that's a good general rule, but I think it's especially important now because the value of that recommendation in the future is going to be much higher if you're in a long unemployment line and you're trying to get one job that has 10 applicants rather than where it was in the last 2 years, which is maybe one job having every 0.6 or 0.8 applicants. If there's a structural change in the labor markets, you want to be in as safe a possible position as you can. And the big thing you can do working in a company of any kind is to do a really good job, be productive, be easy to work with. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think those are great points.
Yeah.
I hope that those are informative for everyone that's watching.
And some of this stuff, I think people know it already. They're already aware of it, or it's kind of in their subconscious, but it's worth bringing to mind now, and perhaps also implementing some changes where necessary, because none of us are perfect. Nobody is. Certainly not me or Alexis, but I think now is a good time to start thinking about these things and putting more to the forefront in your mind in preparation for potential difficulties.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So get out there, stay adaptable as much as you can. Make changes in your life now where possible, where needed. To front run the layoff.
Yeah, I would say sleep on it, but don't sleep on it so that you're not sleepless at night, worried about your job.